At 71, Chris Evert has already lived the kind of life most athletes could only dream about. She became a global tennis icon, collected 18 Grand Slam singles titles, ruled the sport with an almost unnerving calm, and built a reputation as one of the most mentally disciplined champions the game had ever seen. For decades, fans remembered her for the same image: composed, elegant, precise, and seemingly impossible to intimidate. But today, the most difficult battle of Chris Evert's life has nothing to do with tennis. In June 2026, the sporting world was shaken when it was confirmed that Evert's ovarian cancer had returned. After an abnormal scan, she underwent surgery and was forced to step away from her expected Wimbledon commentary duties. The news carried an especially painful weight because Evert had already endured cancer treatment before and had spoken publicly about believing she had moved beyond one of the darkest chapters of her life. For someone whose career was built on controlling pressure, this was an opponent that could not be defeated with a perfect backhand, extraordinary footwork, or relentless concentration. And perhaps that is what makes her story so heartbreaking. For much of her public life, Chris Evert appeared to embody control. On the tennis court, she rarely gave opponents the emotional reaction they were hoping to see. She did not need theatrical celebrations or explosive displays of anger. Her power came from something quieter. She could stay focused for hours, patiently constructing points until the person standing across the net began to unravel. Fans eventually associated that coolness so strongly with Evert that she became known as the Ice Maiden or Ice Princess. Yet the woman behind that image was always far more complicated. Long before stadium crowds knew her name, Chris was a young girl growing up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, in a family where tennis was part of everyday life. Her father, Jimmy Evert, was a professional tennis coach, and from an early age he helped shape the fundamentals that would later make his daughter famous. Chris possessed something that could not simply be taught. She could concentrate. While other young players might become frustrated after mistakes, Evert seemed capable of resetting almost immediately. She learned to keep the ball deep, punish weak shots, and force opponents to play one more point than they wanted to play. As she grew older, it became clear that she was not simply talented. She was exceptional. By her teenage years, Evert was already challenging established stars. She entered the professional world at a time when women's tennis was transforming rapidly, and almost immediately she became one of the faces of that transformation. Her two-handed backhand became one of the most recognizable strokes in the sport. Her baseline consistency was suffocating. On clay, she became nearly untouchable. But success came with a hidden cost. When a teenager becomes famous for never appearing nervous, the world begins expecting her never to be nervous. When a champion becomes famous for winning, people become uncomfortable seeing her lose. And when millions of people believe they understand someone because they have watched her on television, the private person can slowly disappear behind the public image. Evert would spend years carrying that contradiction. She was admired for appearing emotionally controlled, yet her life away from competition included relationships, marriage, motherhood, divorce, disappointment, and periods of painful transition. The scoreboard could tell audiences who had won a match. It could not tell them what happened afterward when the stadium became empty. Still, nothing in professional tennis could fully prepare her for the news that would eventually change everything. In late 2021, Evert learned she had ovarian cancer. The diagnosis was deeply personal because her younger sister, Jean Evert Dubin, had died from ovarian cancer in 2020. That family history ultimately became crucial to Chris's own medical journey. Suddenly, the legendary competitor was confronting something far greater than sport. There would be surgery. There would be treatment. There would be uncertainty. And for perhaps one of the first times in her public life, Chris Evert began speaking openly about fear and vulnerability. Cancer removed many of the protections that fame had once provided. Championships could not guarantee another healthy year. Money could not erase uncertainty. Even extraordinary discipline could not completely control what was happening inside her own body. Yet she continued fighting. After treatment, there was hope. Then came another recurrence. More treatment followed. Once again, she fought her way through it. And then, in June 2026, another devastating development arrived. The cancer had returned. At the same moment, a new documentary about Everett and longtime rival and friend Martina Navratilova was preparing to receive attention around Wimbledon. Chris was recovering from surgery instead of traveling to London. The documentary explored their legendary rivalry, enduring friendship, and their experiences with cancer. It was an extraordinary reversal. Once, Wimbledon had been a place where Chris Evert walked on a center court as one of the most feared competitors in the world. Now she was missing Wimbledon because she was fighting simply to regain her health. But to understand why this latest chapter carries so much emotional weight, we have to understand the woman who came before the diagnosis. Because before Chris Evert became a patient, she was a phenomenon. Before hospitals and scans entered her story, there were packed stadiums, impossible winning streaks, fierce rivalries, enormous expectations, and a young woman who learned very early that the world was always watching. And behind the calm face, millions of fans believed they knew another story had been unfolding all along. Long before illness entered Chris Evert's life, pressure had already become one of her most familiar companions. She learned early that talent could open doors, but expectation could quickly become a burden. Growing up in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Chris was surrounded by tennis. Her father, Jimmy Evert, was not simply a parent cheering from the sidelines. He was a respected teaching professional who understood technique, discipline, and repetition. Under his guidance, Chris developed the foundation that would eventually make her one of the most difficult players in the history of the sport to defeat. There was nothing particularly flashy about her game. That was part of what made it so dangerous. Evert did not rely on overwhelming power. She did not need to blast winners from impossible positions. Instead, she constructed points with patience. She hit deep, accurate ground strokes. She moved opponents from side to side. She waited. And waited. And waited. Eventually, the person across the net would make a mistake. This method required extraordinary mental discipline, especially for someone so young. By the time she was a teenager, Evert was already demonstrating the psychological qualities that would define her professional career. She rarely appeared panicked. She did not waste much energy arguing with herself after errors. Even when a match became tense, her expression often remained almost unchanged. That calmness fascinated audiences. But before the world turned it into a legend, it was simply how Chris had been taught to compete. One of the first moments that announced her arrival came while she was still a teenager. Suddenly, established champions were being forced to take this quiet American girl seriously. She was not intimidated by famous names or large crowds. Her rise was rapid. And with that rise came attention she could never fully escape. During the 1970s, women's tennis was undergoing enormous change. Players were becoming international celebrities. Television was bringing matches into millions of homes. Rivalries were no longer followed only by dedicated tennis fans. They were becoming cultural events. Chris Evert arrived at exactly the right moment. She had youth. She had elegance. She had extraordinary talent. And she had a competitive personality that contrasted sharply with some of the more expressive players around her. Reporters began focusing not only on her tennis, but also on her appearance, relationships, personality, and private life. For a young woman trying to become the best player in the world, the spotlight could be relentless. Yet Evert continued winning. Her breakthrough at the Grand Slam level came in the mid-1970s, when she captured major titles and established herself as the dominant baseline player of her generation. Then something remarkable happened. Winning stopped being surprising. It became expected. That change can be dangerous for any athlete. When the public expects victory, success brings less celebration while defeat brings greater scrutiny. Evert experienced that reality again and again. She became especially dominant on clay, a surface perfectly suited to her patient, precise game. Her ability to sustain long rallies and refuse to give opponents easy points made her almost impossible to break down. The numbers became extraordinary. Tournament after tournament. Season after season. Final after final. But statistics alone cannot explain what it meant to live inside that kind of dominance. Every opponent wanted to be the person who defeated Chris Evert. Every journalist wanted to know whether her reign was ending. Every young contender represented another possible threat. And every loss could become a story. Still, Evert developed a reputation for handling pressure with astonishing control. That was when the image of the Ice Maiden truly took hold. To the public, she seemed emotionally impenetrable. But the nickname was never the whole truth. Evert was competitive, sensitive, thoughtful, and intensely aware of what was happening around her. She simply understood that revealing too much emotion during a match could become a weakness. So she learned to hide it. That ability became one of her greatest weapons. It may also have contributed to one of the defining misunderstandings of her public life. People began assuming that because Chris Evert looked calm, she always felt calm. Because she looked strong, they assumed she never struggled. Because she won so often, they assumed winning made everything easier. Reality was more complicated. Behind the trophies was a young woman growing into adulthood under constant public observation. Romantic relationships became headlines. Personal decisions became entertainment. Even moments that might have remained private for an ordinary person could be examined by strangers. And then came the rivalry that would define much of her career. Martina Navratilova. At first, Evert appeared to have the advantage. But Navratilova transformed herself physically and competitively, becoming stronger, faster, and increasingly aggressive. Their contrasting styles made their matches compelling. Evert was the controlled baseliner. Navratilova was the attacking force. But their rivalry became much more than tactics. Each woman forced the other to evolve. When Martina improved, Chris had to adapt. When Chris found new answers, Martina searched for another level. They would face each other again and again, often with major championships at stake. For fans, it was thrilling. For the two women living through it, the pressure was immense. Imagine reaching the top of your profession, only to discover that someone else is becoming perfectly designed to challenge everything that made you successful. That is what Chris faced. There were painful defeats. There were questions about whether she could keep up. There were moments when the invincible champion suddenly looked vulnerable. And yet she continued returning. That persistence became one of the central themes of Evert's life long before cancer. Whenever circumstances changed, she adapted. Whenever someone threatened her position, she fought. Whenever the world decided it understood her, she revealed another layer. By the end of her career, Chris Evert would leave behind a record that placed her permanently among tennis royalty. But trophies could not protect her from what came next. Because away from the courts, another chapter was beginning. One involving love, marriage, family, sacrifice, and decisions that would reshape her identity. For the woman once defined almost entirely by winning, the hardest question was becoming unavoidable. Who was Chris Evert when there was no match left to play? When Chris Evert finally began stepping away from professional tennis, she faced a challenge that many elite athletes quietly fear. For most of her life, she had known exactly who she was. She was a competitor. She was a champion. She was the woman expected to win. But once the tournaments disappeared from the calendar and the roar of the crowd faded, that identity became harder to hold on to. Retirement can sound peaceful from the outside. No more travel, no more pressure, no more endless training. But for someone who has spent decades measuring life in matches, rankings, and trophies, retirement can also feel like losing the structure that once made everything clear. Chris Evert had to reinvent herself. And that reinvention unfolded alongside a complicated personal life. Her romantic relationships had attracted public attention since she was young. Fame made privacy difficult, and because Evert was one of the most recognizable female athletes in the world, the media often treated her love life as if it were another competition to be scored. Her first marriage was to British tennis player John Lloyd in 1979. For a time, they were one of the sport's most visible couples. But relationships lived under constant scrutiny can carry pressures that audiences rarely see. The marriage eventually ended. Years later, Evert married Olympic skier Andy Mill. Their relationship would become a major chapter in her life, and together they had 3 sons. Motherhood changed Evert profoundly. For years, tennis had demanded that she focus almost entirely on herself. Her body, her schedule, her recovery, her opponent, her next tournament. Suddenly, her priorities shifted. There were children who needed her attention. There were school schedules instead of tournament draws. There were family decisions that could not be solved by simply competing harder. For someone who had spent much of her life pursuing excellence with almost ruthless consistency, motherhood introduced a different kind of responsibility. One that had no ranking system, no trophy ceremony, no clear definition of victory. By many accounts, Evert deeply embraced that role. But building a family did not mean that every part of life became simple. Her marriage to Andy Mill lasted nearly 2 decades before ending in divorce. The separation drew considerable public attention, partly because both were well-known figures, and partly because Evert soon entered another high-profile relationship. In 2008, she married Australian golfer Greg Norman. On paper, the pairing seemed almost cinematic. 2 international sporting legends. 2 people who understood competition, travel, pressure, and fame. Yet the marriage lasted only about 15 months before the couple separated. For tabloid culture, it became another celebrity breakup. For the people involved, it was something far more human. The end of a marriage can bring grief even when both people know it should end. It can force someone to reconsider decisions that once felt certain. And for Evert, whose professional life had been built around precision and control, relationships were reminders that not everything could be planned. You can study an opponent. You can train for a tournament. You can adjust tactics after losing a set. But human relationships do not follow predictable patterns. That difference may have been especially difficult for someone who had spent decades mastering control. Evert later spoke publicly about aspects of her personal life with a level of self-awareness that contrasted with the emotionally guarded image of her playing years. She acknowledged mistakes. She acknowledged periods of uncertainty. And she did not pretend that fame had protected her from difficult choices. In some ways, this stage of her life revealed a side of Chris that audiences had rarely been allowed to see during her career. Not the ice princess. Not the 18-time Grand Slam champion. Just a woman trying to understand who she was after the applause faded. Her sons became one of the strongest constants in that process. Family provided something tennis never could. A relationship with life that did not depend on winning. Still, the emotional transitions were significant. She had spent her youth chasing greatness. Then she spent adulthood trying to balance family, relationships, public expectations, and the lingering identity of being Chris Evert. The world never completely stopped seeing the champion. Even when she became a broadcaster and commentator, her presence at major tournaments carried history with it. People remembered her rivalries. They remembered Wimbledon. They remembered Roland Garros. They remembered the backhand. But behind that public familiarity, Evert was entering a stage of life where other questions mattered more. What happens when your children grow up? What happens when marriages end? What happens when your body begins reminding you that even legendary athletes grow older? For years, these were the kinds of changes Evert could navigate gradually. Then everything accelerated. In 2020, tragedy struck her family. Chris's younger sister, Jean Evert Dubin, died from ovarian cancer. Jean had also been a talented tennis player, and the sisters shared far more than a famous family name. Her death was devastating. But it would later take on another meaning, one no one could fully understand at the time. Because Jean's cancer journey would eventually help Chris discover something about her own health. Something hidden. Something potentially deadly. After Jean's diagnosis and death, genetic information within the family became increasingly important. Chris underwent genetic testing and learned she carried a pathogenic variant associated with increased cancer risk. That knowledge led doctors to recommend preventative surgery. And during that process, something shocking was discovered. Cancer. Chris Evert, the athlete whose body had once been trained to withstand endless hours of elite competition, was now facing ovarian cancer herself. There had been no dramatic collapse on a tennis court. No obvious warning that millions of fans could see. The disease had been quietly developing inside one of the strongest competitors of her generation. And suddenly, every disappointment that had come before, defeat, divorce, retirement, public scrutiny, looked different. Because this was no longer about rebuilding a career or repairing a relationship. This was about survival. The woman who had spent her entire life preparing for pressure was about to enter the match she could never have trained for. And this time, the opponent would not be standing across a net. It was already inside her. For Chris Evert, the word cancer did not arrive as an abstract medical possibility. It arrived carrying the memory of her sister. Jean Evert Dubin had died from ovarian cancer in 2020, and that loss changed the way Chris thought about her own health. What had once seemed like a tragedy happening to someone she loved suddenly became a warning that could not be ignored. The emotional weight of that realization was enormous. Chris had spent decades trusting her body. Her legs had carried her through punishing rallies. Her concentration had survived championship pressure. Her endurance had allowed her to compete at the highest level year after year. But cancer introduced a frightening truth. A body can appear strong on the outside, while something dangerous develops silently within. That is one reason ovarian cancer can be so terrifying. Symptoms may be vague, subtle, or easy to dismiss. By the time some women receive a diagnosis, the disease may already have progressed significantly. For Evert, family history became critical. After her sister's illness, genetic testing revealed information that doctors could use to assess Chris's own risk. She learned that she carried a harmful BRCA1 genetic variant, a finding associated with a higher risk of certain cancers, including ovarian and breast cancer. That discovery led to additional medical decisions. And eventually, during preventive surgery, cancer was found. The moment transformed her life. This was not a tennis injury. There would be no predictable rehabilitation schedule. There was no guarantee that discipline alone could produce the outcome she wanted. Chris Evert was now a cancer patient. For someone who had spent most of her life being described as strong, controlled, and almost impossible to rattle, the diagnosis forced her into unfamiliar territory. Fear. Uncertainty. Vulnerability. But Evert did something important. She spoke publicly about it. Rather than hiding the diagnosis entirely, she used her platform to encourage others to pay attention to family medical history and genetic testing. That decision gave her personal struggle a wider meaning. Jean's death had been devastating, but the information connected to her illness may have helped Chris detect her own cancer at an earlier stage than might otherwise have happened. The sisters' stories became painfully connected. One life was lost. Another may have been protected because warning signs were taken seriously. For Chris, that connection was impossible to ignore. She underwent surgery and chemotherapy. Cancer treatment can strip away many of the symbols people associate with strength. Patients become dependent on doctors. Their schedules revolve around appointments. Their bodies can feel unfamiliar. Energy disappears. Plans become uncertain. The future, once taken for granted, can suddenly feel conditional. For Evert, this was an extraordinary reversal. During her tennis career, she controlled almost every detail of preparation. Training times, match strategies, recovery, travel, nutrition, practice. Cancer did not respect that structure. A scan could change everything. A test result could redefine the next several months. A medical conversation could carry more emotional significance than any championship final she had ever played. Still, the competitor inside her did not disappear. Evert approached treatment with the same determination that had defined her career. But this time, strength looked different. It was not about refusing to show emotion. It was not about pretending she was fearless. Instead, strength meant accepting that fear existed and moving forward anyway. That distinction matters. The young Chris Evert had once been celebrated for looking untouched by pressure. The older Chris Evert was learning that courage did not require emotional silence. She could admit that cancer frightened her. She could acknowledge that uncertainty was difficult. She could speak about her sister. She could allow people to see the person behind the champion. For many longtime fans, this vulnerability made her story even more powerful. They had watched her dominate tennis for years. Now they were watching her fight something completely different. There were no stadiums, no trophies, no official rankings. Only treatment, recovery, and hope. After completing her first course of treatment, Evert received encouraging news. The cancer had been detected at an early stage, and doctors were optimistic. For a period, it appeared that the worst might be behind her. She returned to public life. She continued working around tennis. She talked about gratitude. She spent time with family. And there was a growing sense that perhaps the frightening chapter had been contained. But cancer can change the meaning of time. Before diagnosis, a year may simply be another year. After diagnosis, every clear scan can feel like a gift. Every birthday can carry additional weight. Every family gathering can become something worth remembering more carefully. For Evert, life after cancer was no longer exactly the same life she had known before. She had confronted mortality in a way championships never forced her to do. She had watched her sister die. She had learned that she carried a genetic risk. She had undergone surgery. She had endured chemotherapy. And she had emerged with a deeper understanding of how fragile even the strongest life can be. Yet just when hope appeared to be taking hold, another frightening development arrived. In late 2023, Evert revealed that her ovarian cancer had returned. The disease doctors had fought before was back. Another surgery followed. Another round of chemotherapy. Another period of uncertainty. Imagine the emotional impact. You survive the first diagnosis. You endure treatment. You begin believing you can move forward. Then the phone rings. Another scan. Another conversation. Another reminder that the battle is not finished. For Chris Evert, the second diagnosis was not simply medical. It reopened everything. The fear. The memories of Jean. The vulnerability. The question no patient wants to ask. What if it keeps coming back? Still, Evert refused to let cancer become the only story people told about her. She remained connected to tennis. She remained connected to family. She remained hopeful. And once again, treatment appeared to work. For a time, there was another reason to believe the disease had been pushed back. But the story was not over. Because years after her first diagnosis, at an age when many people might expect to spend their days enjoying the rewards of a remarkable life, Chris Evert would receive devastating news once again. Cancer had returned. And at 71, the woman who had spent a lifetime surviving pressure was being asked to fight one more match. A match with no scoreboard, no predictable ending, and no guarantee that past victories would matter. For a time, Chris Evert had reason to believe that the darkest chapter was finally moving behind her. After her second battle with ovarian cancer, treatment again brought encouraging results. She returned to the tennis world, continued appearing as a respected commentator, spent time with her family, and tried to embrace a life no longer dominated by medical appointments. There was relief. There was gratitude. And perhaps most importantly, there was hope. But cancer has a cruel way of changing the relationship a person has with hope. Once you have heard the words, "Your cancer has returned," every future scan carries a different emotional weight. A routine medical appointment is no longer routine. A phone call from a doctor can change the direction of an entire year. And even during periods when the disease cannot be detected, the fear that it might return can remain quietly in the background. Chris knew this better than most. She had already lived through the diagnosis once. Then she had lived through a recurrence. She had endured surgeries and chemotherapy, repeatedly rebuilding her strength afterward. By 2024, she had again received encouraging news that she was cancer-free. For many people, that might have felt like the ending. For Chris, it was another chance to live. She returned to the familiar world of tennis. The sport had been part of her identity since childhood, and even decades after retirement, Grand Slam tournaments remained places where she belonged. She was no longer standing at the baseline trying to defeat an opponent. Now she analyzed matches, reflected on champions, and brought decades of experience to audiences watching from around the world. Wimbledon remained especially meaningful. Chris had won the singles championship there 3 times. The lawns of the All England Club represented some of the greatest moments of her career. But in June 2026, Wimbledon suddenly became the setting for another painful reminder of how dramatically her life had changed. Following CT and PET scans, Evert learned that her ovarian cancer had returned again. She was 71 years old. This was now another recurrence in a battle that had begun in 2021. The news was devastating not because Chris had stopped fighting, but because she had already fought so much. Once again, she underwent surgery. Once again, chemotherapy became part of the plan. And once again, professional commitments had to become secondary to survival. Evert announced that she would not attend Wimbledon in 2026 and would step away from professional duties for the following months while focusing on treatment and recovery. For longtime fans, the symbolism was difficult to ignore. There had been a time when Chris Evert arriving at Wimbledon meant anticipation. Could she win another championship? Who could challenge her? Would her legendary baseline game survive another tournament? Now the questions were painfully different. How was she responding to treatment? How was she feeling? When would she be strong enough to return? The trophies were still there. The records remained untouched by illness. But none of them could answer those questions. That is one of the harshest realities of serious disease. Achievement does not create immunity. Fame does not negotiate with biology. Past victories cannot guarantee the next one. Chris Evert could look back at 18 Grand Slam singles championships, decades of international admiration, and a permanent place in tennis history. Yet cancer reduced life to something much simpler. Another treatment. Another recovery. Another day with family. Another reason to keep going. Still, Evert refused to describe herself as defeated. In her public statement, she characterized ovarian cancer as relentless, while emphasizing that she intended to remain optimistic and determined. Those words carried special meaning coming from her. Determination had always defined Chris Evert. But the form it took had changed. At 25, determination meant surviving a long rally against another champion. At 30, it meant adapting when Martina Navratilova became stronger and threatened her dominance. At 71, Determination meant allowing doctors to operate, enduring treatment again, and accepting that life would temporarily have to shrink around recovery. The opponent had changed. The mentality had not. And there was another emotional dimension to this period. Around the same time, renewed attention was being given to Chris Evert's extraordinary relationship with Martina Navratilova. Their rivalry had once divided tennis fans. They represented contrasting styles, contrasting personalities, and competing visions of greatness. Over decades, however, rivalry became friendship. And eventually, both women experienced cancer. Suddenly, one of the most famous rivalries in sports history had taken on an entirely different meaning. Two women who had spent years trying to defeat each other on a tennis court now understood something far more intimate about fear, health, aging, and survival. Their story was explored in the documentary Chris and Martina, The Final Set, adding another layer of reflection to a relationship that had lasted across generations of tennis. But for Chris, the greatest source of strength may have been even closer. Her family. Her sons. Her friends. The people who knew her without needing to see a trophy first. At this stage of life, those relationships carried a different importance. Because cancer has a way of removing unnecessary distractions. Things that once seemed enormous can suddenly feel small. Old headlines fade. Past divorces become history. Arguments lose their significance. Even championships can become memories rather than priorities. What remains is time. Time with children. Time with friends. Time to laugh. Time to tell people what they mean to you. Time to wake up tomorrow and continue. Chris Evert had spent much of her youth chasing greatness. Now greatness looked completely different. It was not about dominating an opponent. It was about maintaining hope when there was every reason to be afraid. And perhaps that is why the story of Chris Evert at 71 is not simply heartbreaking. It is also deeply human. Because beneath the image of an 18-time Grand Slam champion is a woman confronting the same frightening uncertainty that millions of families have experienced. She does not know exactly what comes next. Neither do her fans. But one thing has remained remarkably consistent throughout her life. Chris Evert keeps showing up for the next point. And now, more than ever, every point matters. For decades, the names Chris Evert and Martina Navratilova were almost impossible to separate. They represented one of the greatest rivalries in sports history. Two champions. Two completely different styles. Two women repeatedly standing between each other and another major title. On the court, their matches could feel ruthless. Evert relied on precision, patience, and extraordinary consistency from the baseline. Navratilova attacked. She came forward aggressively, used athleticism to take time away, and transformed herself into one of the most physically dominant players women's tennis had ever seen. For years, they pushed each other toward levels neither might have reached alone. But time changed the meaning of their rivalry. The scoreboards disappeared. The trophies were already won. The crowds moved on to new stars. And what remained was something more enduring than competition. Friendship. That friendship would eventually become especially meaningful because both women were forced to confront cancer. For Chris, the connection was profound. Here was a woman who had once represented perhaps the greatest professional threat of her life. Now Martina understood something about fear that no former opponent could explain through tennis alone. Cancer had stripped their rivalry of its old urgency. Nobody cared anymore who had won more of a particular tournament. Nobody was keeping score the same way. The conversations were no longer about forehands, serves, or tactics. They were about health, treatment, uncertainty, survival. That transformation says something powerful about aging. When people are young, victories can feel permanent. Losing a championship can seem devastating. A ranking can feel like identity. But decades later, the significance changes. Chris and Martina had already proven everything that could be proven on a tennis court. Then life gave them a completely different test. And this time, they were not on opposite sides. They were in the same corner. The emotional weight of that bond became even more visible as the two reflected publicly on their history together. Their relationship had never been simple. They had competed with extraordinary intensity. They had sometimes been close friends even while trying to defeat one another. They knew each other's strengths and weaknesses in a way few people could understand. They also knew the strange loneliness of becoming a global champion. Fame can surround someone with people while still making genuine understanding difficult. Other athletes may sympathize. Family members may support. Fans may admire. But only another person who has lived inside the same pressure can fully understand what that life demands. Chris and Martina had shared that world. And later, painfully, they shared another one. Cancer. For Chris, this period also brought a new appreciation for what remained outside tennis. Her 3 sons had long been central to her life after competition. Motherhood had given her an identity that was not measured by rankings or titles. Now, during another period of treatment, family carried an even deeper meaning. There is a difference between knowing intellectually that family matters and experiencing a serious illness that suddenly makes time feel fragile. A dinner becomes more important. A phone call matters more. Ordinary afternoons become meaningful. Things once postponed become things worth doing now. Cancer can change the emotional value of everyday life. For a woman who had spent decades living by tournament schedules, the contrast was striking. Professional tennis had demanded constant forward movement. Win a tournament? Prepare for the next one. Lose a final? Travel to the next city. Finish a season? Start training again. There was always another match. Cancer offered no such rhythm. It forced stillness. Recovery required patience. Treatment could determine the calendar. Plans had to remain flexible. For someone as disciplined as Chris Evert, surrendering control may have been one of the most difficult parts. Yet there was also growth in that surrender. The younger Evert had become famous for emotional restraint. The older Evert seemed increasingly willing to admit that vulnerability did not cancel strength. She could be frightened and determined at the same time. She could need help and still be powerful. She could speak openly about cancer without allowing the disease to define every part of her identity. That distinction matters because celebrity illness is often reduced to dramatic headlines. People see words like battle, tragedy, or heartbreaking, and sometimes forget that behind those words is a person living through countless ordinary moments. Waiting for test results. Talking with doctors. Trying to sleep. Wondering whether treatment is working. Trying not to let family members see every fear. Trying to remain hopeful without pretending certainty exists. Chris Evert's story deserves more than spectacle. It deserves perspective. At 71, she is not simply the legendary athlete who became ill. She is a woman who has lived long enough to see the meaning of victory change completely. Once, victory meant lifting a trophy in front of thousands. Later, victory meant raising 3 sons. Then it meant recovering from one diagnosis. Then surviving another recurrence. Now, victory may simply mean getting through another cycle of treatment and reaching another day with the people she loves. That is a much quieter form of greatness. But perhaps it is also a more universal one. Most people will never play on center court. Most will never win a Grand Slam. Most will never know what it feels like to be ranked number 1 in the world. But millions understand what it means to worry about someone they love. Millions understand the fear of a medical diagnosis. Millions understand the feeling of wanting more time. That is where Chris Evert's story moves beyond tennis. The statistics made her famous. The championships made her historic. But the vulnerability makes her human. And as she continues treatment, the question surrounding her life is no longer whether she will win another title. That chapter was settled long ago. The question now is what her extraordinary journey ultimately teaches about resilience, family, mortality, and what remains when the applause finally stops. Because at 71, Chris Evert may be playing the most meaningful match of her life. And this time, the people watching are not waiting for a trophy. They are simply hoping she gets more time. At 71, Chris Evert's story no longer fits neatly inside the boundaries of a tennis court. For most of her public life, people measured her in numbers. 18 Grand Slam singles titles. Years near the top of the rankings. An extraordinary record on clay. Countless matches won through patience, discipline, and an ability to remain composed when everyone around her was under pressure. Those numbers helped establish her as one of the greatest players the sport has ever known. But they are not the most important part of her story anymore. Time has changed the meaning of everything. The trophies remain. The photographs remain. The old matches can still be replayed. A new generation can still watch the two-handed backhand, the precise footwork, the calm expression, and the relentless baseline consistency that made Chris Evert so difficult to defeat. But the woman behind those images has lived many lives since then. She became a wife. She became a mother. She experienced divorce. She watched her children grow. She lost her sister. She confronted cancer. Then she confronted it again. And again. Those chapters created a different kind of legacy. One that cannot be displayed inside a trophy case. For younger fans, Chris Evert may be primarily a commentator or a name from tennis history. For older fans, she represents an entire era. They remember when her rivalry with Martina Navratilova could dominate the sporting world. They remember the contrast. Chris at the baseline. Martina charging the net. Chris appearing calm. Martina bringing intensity. Each woman forcing the other to become better. At the time, the rivalry seemed enormous. Years later, it became clear that the friendship mattered even more. That may be one of the most beautiful transformations in Evert's story. Competition can create enemies temporarily. Shared history can create something deeper. Chris and Martina spent years fighting for the same trophies. Decades later, they could speak as two women who understood fame, aging, illness, fear, and resilience in ways few others ever could. Life had changed the scoreboard. And perhaps that is the central lesson of Chris Evert's journey. The things that seem most important at one stage of life can become surprisingly small at another. A lost final once felt devastating. Later, a medical scan carried far greater consequences. A ranking once defined success. Later, time with family mattered more. A trophy once represented victory. Later, simply hearing encouraging news from a doctor could feel more valuable than any championship. That does not diminish what Evert accomplished in tennis. It gives those accomplishments perspective. She became one of the greatest because she knew how to keep going. That same quality has remained visible during her health struggles. But there is an important difference. In tennis, determination can influence the outcome directly. Train harder. Prepare better. Stay focused. Force your opponent to hit one more ball. Illness is not that simple. A patient can do everything doctors recommend and still face uncertainty. That is why describing cancer only as a fight can sometimes be misleading. There is courage in treatment, but illness is not a moral competition. A recurrence does not mean someone failed to fight hard enough. Chris Evert's repeated experiences with cancer demonstrate exactly that. She has shown discipline, optimism, and openness. Yet the disease has returned more than once. That reality makes her situation painful, but it also makes the way she has responded especially meaningful. She has used her visibility to talk about genetic testing and family medical history. Her sister Jean's experience became an important part of Chris's decision to investigate her own genetic risk. That knowledge ultimately played a role in discovering her cancer. By sharing that story publicly, Everett turned something deeply personal into information that could encourage other families to have conversations they might otherwise avoid. That may become one of the most consequential parts of her legacy. Not another tennis statistic. A warning. A conversation. A woman somewhere deciding to speak with her doctor because she heard Chris Everett's story. There is something powerful about that. A champion who once influenced people through sport now potentially influences them through vulnerability. And there is still another part of her legacy. Her family. For all the attention surrounding her career, Everett has repeatedly spoken about the importance of her sons and the life she built beyond professional tennis. Those relationships help explain why the current chapter carries so much emotional weight. When someone faces serious illness in their 70s, the desire for more time is rarely abstract. It means more birthdays, more conversations, more holidays, more ordinary mornings, more opportunities to watch children and grandchildren move through life. Those moments are impossible to quantify. Perhaps that is why they become so valuable. Chris Evert spent her youth proving that she could master pressure better than almost anyone. At 71, life has asked something different from her. Not perfection. Not dominance. Not emotional control. Acceptance. Patience. Hope. And the willingness to continue even when the future cannot be predicted. That is where the tragedy and inspiration of her story exist side by side. It is heartbreaking that someone who has already endured so much must face another recurrence of cancer. But it would be wrong to reduce her life to sadness. Chris Evert is still here. Still surrounded by a legacy few athletes could ever match. Still loved by family, friends, and generations of tennis fans. Still confronting the future on her own terms. For decades, people watched Chris Evert because they wanted to see whether she could win. Today, many are watching for a very different reason. They want to see her healthy. They want to see her return. They want to see one of tennis's greatest champions receive something far more valuable than another trophy. More time. Because when the final chapter of Chris Evert's story is eventually written, the 18 Grand Slam titles will always matter. But the deeper story may be about something much simpler. A woman who discovered that true strength was not about never showing fear. It was about continuing despite it. And after everything Chris Evert has faced, that may be the greatest victory of all.